In a quiet little town surrounded by rolling hills and endless fields, there lived a remarkable woman named Eleanor Ellie Thompson. At 93 years old, Ellie was as sharp as ever, with a twinkle in her eye that hinted at a lifetime of stories. Her home wasn't just a house. It was a sprawling ranch that had been passed down through generations. The land held more than soil and grass. It carried memories of laughter, love, and hard work. Every corner of the property told a tale. The weathered barn where her late husband taught their children to ride horses, the garden bursting with sunflowers she planted decades ago, and even the creaky wooden fence that seemed to groan along with her when she leaned on it. Ellie's days were simple but fulfilling. She woke up early each morning, brewed herself a strong cup of coffee, and stepped outside to greet the day. Her trusty horse, Daisy, waited patiently for her in the paddock, nickering softly as soon as she appeared. Despite her age, Ellie refused to slow down. She pruned her rose bushes, scattered feed for her chickens, and sometimes sat under the shade of the ancient oak tree at the edge of the property. That tree meant the world to her. It had been planted by her husband shortly after they got married, and its towering branches felt like an embrace from him whenever she rested beneath them. But lately, something had changed. Ellie noticed strange envelopes arriving in her mailbox. At first, she thought they might be bills or advertisements, but when she opened one, her heart sank. It was a letter from the local homeowners association, HOA, a group she barely knew existed until now. The tone was cold and impersonal, demanding that she make drastic changes to her beloved ranch. They said the red barn needed repainting, the rusted tractor parked near the shed had to go, and most painfully, the majestic oak tree violated some obscure rule about obstructing views. Confused and hurt, Ellie tried to reason with them. She wrote polite letters explaining how long she'd lived there and how much the ranch meant to her family. But no matter what she did, the HOA only grew more aggressive. More letters arrived, each one harsher than the last. Eventually, they threatened legal action if she didn't comply within 30 days. For someone like Ellie, who had spent nearly a century living independently, this felt like an invasion. She couldn't understand why anyone would want to take away the things that made her life meaningful. Her neighbor, Sam, noticed the worry etched on her face during his daily visits. He often stopped by to help with chores or simply keep her company. One afternoon, while sipping lemonade on her porch, he asked what was troubling her. Reluctantly, Ellie showed him the stack of letters. Sam's jaw tightened as he read through them. "This isn't right," he muttered. "You shouldn't have to deal with this alone." Though Ellie appreciated his concern, she didn't see any way out. After all, what could she do against such a powerful organization? But deep down, she wondered if there was someone else who could help. Someone stronger, braver, and maybe even a little intimidating. Someone like her son, Jack. Though he hadn't visited in years, she knew he had always been her protector. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to call him home. The letters kept coming, each one more demanding than the last. Ellie tried to ignore them at first, hoping they would eventually lose interest or realize how unreasonable their requests were. But the HOA wasn't backing down. Every envelope felt like a weight pressing down on her shoulders. They wanted her to repaint the barn, but the red paint she'd used years ago was peeling because it had been exposed to decades of sun and rain. It told the story of time passing, not neglect. They complained about the rusted tractor near the shed, even though it hadn't moved in over 20 years and was practically part of the landscape. And then there was the oak tree, the towering giant that stood as a living memorial to her late husband. The HOA claimed it blocked views and posed a safety hazard, though Ellie couldn't imagine how something so rooted in history could ever be dangerous. As the days went by, Ellie's frustration turned into fear. She didn't have the energy or the money to make all these changes. Even if she did, she couldn't bear the thought of erasing pieces of her life just to satisfy people who didn't understand what the ranch meant to her. One morning, as she sat under the shade of the oak tree, with tears streaming down her face, Sam found her. He knelt beside her, his voice soft but firm. "Ellie, you can't keep carrying this burden alone. You need help." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I know," she whispered, "but who's going to stand up for me? These people, they don't care about us small folks. All they see is rules." Sam hesitated, then said, "What about Jack? Have you thought about calling him?" Ellie froze. Jack, her son, a name she hadn't spoken aloud in years. The mere mention of him brought back a flood of emotions: pride, sadness, longing. Jack had joined the Navy right out of high school, leaving the ranch behind to serve his country. Over the years, he became a Navy SEAL, earning medals and commendations for his bravery. But distance grew between them after his father passed away. Work kept Jack busy, and visits home became rare. Still, whenever Ellie thought of him, she remembered the little boy who used to climb trees and chase chickens around the yard. That same boy had grown into a man capable of facing anything head-on. "I don't want to bother him," Ellie said finally. "He's got his own life now. This is my problem, not his." Sam shook his head. "Ellie, listen to me. This isn't just your problem anymore. Those people are trying to take away something precious from you, something that belongs to your family. If anyone can handle this, it's Jack. He's always protected you, hasn't he?" Her heart ached at the truth in Sam's words. Reluctantly, she picked up the phone later that evening. Her hands trembled as she dialed the number, unsure of what to say. When Jack answered, his deep, calm voice sent a wave of comfort through her. "Mom, is everything okay?" She took a shaky breath and began to explain. At first, she downplayed the situation, not wanting to worry him. But as she described the HOA's relentless demands and the looming threat of legal action, her voice cracked. Jack listened silently, his jaw tightening with every word. By the time she finished, he was already making plans. "Don't worry, Mom," he said firmly. "I'll be there soon. Nobody messes with our family, not while I'm around." Hanging up the phone, Ellie felt a flicker of hope for the first time in weeks. Jack was coming home. The boy who once climbed trees and chased chickens was returning, not as a child, but as a man who had faced danger and triumphed. For the first time since the HOA's threats began, Ellie allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things would turn out all right. Jack Thompson hadn't set foot on the ranch in over a decade. Life had taken him far from the quiet fields and familiar sights of his childhood. After years of service as a Navy SEAL, he had built a life for himself in another state, working as a private security consultant. But no matter how far he traveled or how much he accomplished, the ranch always lingered in his mind, a place filled with memories both joyful and painful. When he heard his mother's trembling voice on the phone, something inside him shifted. He didn't hesitate. He booked the first flight home. The journey back was bittersweet. As the plane descended into the small regional airport, Jack looked out the window at the patchwork of green fields below. Memories flooded his mind. The sound of his father's laughter echoing through the barn, the smell of fresh hay after a summer rain, and the way the old oak tree seemed to guard the property like a sentinel. These were the things that shaped him, taught him resilience, and gave him strength. And now, those same things were under threat. When Jack arrived at the ranch, Ellie greeted him with tears in her eyes. She hugged him tightly, her frail arms wrapping around him, as if she never wanted to let go. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was so much left unsaid between them. Years of distance, missed birthdays, and unspoken apologies. But none of that mattered right now. What mattered was protecting their family legacy. Jack wasted no time getting to work. He walked the property with Ellie, inspecting every detail mentioned in the HOA's letters. The red barn wasn't just peeling paint, it was history. The rusted tractor wasn't junk. It was a relic of hard labor and perseverance. And the ancient oak tree wasn't an obstruction. It was a symbol of love and devotion. Each item carried meaning, and Jack couldn't understand why anyone would want to erase it. Ellie watched as her son moved with purpose, his military training evident in his methodical approach. He took notes, snapped photos, and asked questions about the timeline of events. "Don't worry, Mom," he said reassuringly. "I'll figure this out." That evening, Jack sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers and documents. He spent hours researching local property laws, zoning regulations, and the HOA's own bylaws. It didn't take long for him to spot inconsistencies. The HOA claimed their rules applied uniformly, but Jack found evidence suggesting they often targeted older homeowners who couldn't fight back. Their demands weren't just unreasonable, they bordered on bullying. The next morning, Jack visited a local attorney recommended by Sam. The lawyer, a gruff but kind man named Mr. Peterson, listened intently as Jack laid out the situation. "This isn't just about your mom's ranch," Mr. Peterson said thoughtfully. "It's about principle. People shouldn't be forced to give up what matters most because someone else decides it doesn't fit their vision of perfection." With the lawyer's guidance, Jack began preparing for battle. He gathered evidence, drafted letters, and mapped out strategies. At the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about legal arguments. It was personal. This was his family's land, his father's legacy, and his mother's sanctuary. No one was going to take that away without a fight. As he worked, Jack noticed something unexpected. Being back on the ranch felt right. Despite the tension with the HOA, there was comfort in walking the same paths he had as a child. Even the challenges ahead seemed manageable when faced alongside his mother. Whatever happened next, Jack knew one thing for certain. He wasn't leaving until justice was served. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and the air was thick with tension. Jack stood beside his mother, who clutched her cane tightly as they walked into the community center where the board held their sessions. Ellie had never attended one of these meetings before. She didn't even know they existed until recently. But Jack insisted she come. "This is your fight too, Mom," he told her. "You deserve to be here." Inside, the room buzzed with murmurs. Neighbors sat in folding chairs, some glancing nervously at each other, while others scrolled through their phones, clearly uninterested. At the front of the room sat the HOA board members, 5 individuals dressed in business casual attire, exuding an air of authority that felt out of place in such a small-town setting. Their expressions were stern, almost rehearsed, as if they were preparing for yet another routine discussion about property values and landscaping rules. Jack took a seat near the front, positioning himself so he could address the board directly. Ellie sat beside him, her hands trembling slightly, but her eyes steady. She wasn't going to let fear win. Not today. As the meeting began, Jack leaned forward, his presence commanding attention without saying a word. It wasn't just his height or broad shoulders. It was the quiet confidence that radiated from him, the kind born from years of leading teams under pressure. When it was time for public comments, Jack rose to his feet. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him. He introduced himself calmly, explaining his connection to the ranch and summarizing the situation. Then he launched into his case. With precision and clarity, he pointed out inconsistencies in the HOA's enforcement of rules. Some homeowners had similar violations, but hadn't been penalized. Others had made changes only after being given years of extensions. Why then was Ellie being singled out? The president of the HOA, a middle-aged man named Mr. Grayson, tried to interrupt, but Jack didn't falter. He presented photos, documents, and even emails showing how the HOA's demands had escalated unnecessarily. His voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it, a tone that left no room for argument. At one point, Mr. Grayson attempted to intimidate him, leaning forward and raising his voice. "These are standard procedures, Mr. Thompson. Your mother has been non-compliant for months." Jack didn't blink. Instead, he smiled faintly, a smile that sent a ripple of unease through the room. "Non-compliant," he repeated, his voice low but firm. "My mother has lived on that land for over 60 years. She's maintained it, cared for it, and preserved its history while contributing to this community. And now you're telling me she's non-compliant because her barn doesn't match your idea of perfection." He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering the final blow. "By the way, I'm not just someone's son. I'm a retired Navy SEAL. I've spent my career protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. So trust me when I say this. I don't back down easily. If you want to take my family's ranch, you'd better be ready for a fight." The room went completely silent. Board members exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to respond. Neighbors whispered among themselves, some nodding approvingly. For the first time, the HOA looked less like an untouchable authority and more like a group of ordinary people caught off guard by someone who refused to back down. As Jack sat down, Ellie reached over and squeezed his hand. Her grip was weak, but her gratitude was immense. They weren't just fighting for a piece of land. They were standing up for fairness, dignity, and the right to preserve what mattered most. And for the first time since the ordeal began, Ellie allowed herself to feel hopeful. Word of Jack's confrontation at the HOA meeting spread like wildfire through the small town. By the next morning, it seemed everyone knew about the retired Navy SEAL who had stood up to the board on behalf of his mother. Neighbors who had once kept their distance from Ellie's situation suddenly felt compelled to speak out. Some stopped by the ranch to offer support, bringing pies, casseroles, or simply words of encouragement. Others shared stories of their own frustrations with the HOA, how they'd been pressured into making costly changes or forced to comply with rules that made no sense. Sam played a key role in amplifying the story beyond the town limits. He posted about the issue on social media, sharing photos of Ellie's ranch and detailing the HOA's unreasonable demands. The post quickly gained traction, drawing comments from people across the country who were outraged by the treatment of a 93-year-old woman. "This isn't just about one family," Sam wrote in the caption. "It's about standing up against bullies who think they can push people around because they hold power." The growing attention put immense pressure on the HOA. Local news outlets picked up the story, interviewing Ellie and Jack for segments that aired during evening broadcasts. When reporters asked Jack about his military background, he downplayed it, focusing instead on the injustice faced by his mother and others like her. "I didn't come here to intimidate anyone," he said firmly. "I came here to protect my mom and make sure she doesn't lose what's rightfully hers. If the HOA wants to enforce rules, fine, but let's do it fairly." Meanwhile, the community began organizing. Inspired by Jack's courage, neighbors rallied together, attending subsequent meetings en masse to voice their concerns. At first, the HOA tried to dismiss them, insisting their decisions were final. But as more and more residents spoke up, cracks started to show in the board's facade. Even some members of the HOA grew uncomfortable, realizing they might have overstepped their authority. One particularly heated meeting turned into a turning point. A young father stood up to share how the HOA had fined him for painting his front door a shade of blue not approved by their guidelines. An elderly widow recounted how she was threatened with legal action for failing to trim hedges that were technically 2 inches too tall. Each story added fuel to the fire, exposing the HOA's pattern of targeting vulnerable homeowners while ignoring violations committed by wealthier residents. Jack continued to lead the charge, combining his legal research with strategic negotiations. With Mr. Peterson's help, he drafted a formal proposal outlining reasonable compromises that would preserve the character of properties like Ellie's Ranch without compromising safety or aesthetics. For example, instead of cutting down the oak tree, they suggested trimming specific branches if necessary. Instead of repainting the barn entirely, they proposed patching areas where the wood was exposed. Finally, after weeks of mounting pressure, from public scrutiny, legal threats, and sheer numbers, the HOA relented. In a tense but ultimately decisive session, they announced they would withdraw their complaints against Ellie and revisit their policies to ensure fairness moving forward. While they didn't admit wrongdoing, their decision spoke volumes. As the meeting concluded, applause erupted from the crowd. Neighbors hugged each other, celebrating not just Ellie's victory, but a collective triumph over intimidation. Jack shook hands with several attendees, thanking them for their support. Meanwhile, Ellie sat quietly, tears streaming down her face. She hadn't expected this kind of solidarity, not in her wildest dreams. And yet, here it was, proof that when people united for a common cause, even the most daunting challenges could be overcome. With the HOA's decision to back down, life on the ranch began to return to normal. But it wasn't quite the same as before. Something had shifted, not just for Ellie and Jack, but for the entire community. The battle against the HOA had awakened a sense of unity that many residents hadn't felt in years. Neighbors who once barely knew each other's names now gathered regularly, sharing meals, stories, and laughter. The ranch, once a quiet retreat, became a symbol of resilience and strength, a reminder that standing together could achieve what seemed impossible alone. Jack decided to stay on at the ranch longer than he'd originally planned. At first, he told himself it was to help his mother make a few improvements to ensure compliance with the HOA's revised guidelines. But deep down, he knew there was more to it. Being back on the land where he grew up brought a sense of peace he hadn't realized he was missing. He spent his days fixing fences, painting patches on the barn, and trimming branches from the ancient oak tree. Each task connected him to memories of his father, who used to tackle these chores with a smile and a whistle. Ellie watched her son with pride, marveling at how much he resembled his dad, not just in looks, but in spirit. She often joined him outside, sitting under the shade of the oak tree while he worked. They talked about everything: old family stories, Jack's time in the Navy, and even the pain of their years apart. Slowly but surely, they began to heal the distance that had grown between them. For Ellie, having Jack by her side again felt like reclaiming a piece of her heart she thought was lost forever. The community didn't forget what Jack had done for them either. People continued to stop by the ranch, bringing fresh produce, baked goods, or offers to help with repairs. One neighbor, a retired carpenter named Hank, volunteered to rebuild part of the creaky wooden fence. Another offered to plant new flowers along the driveway to brighten up the entrance. These small acts of kindness transformed the ranch into something even more beautiful, not just physically but emotionally. Even Sam stayed involved, using his social media platform to keep the momentum going. He created an online group called Neighbors United, where residents could discuss concerns, share ideas, and hold the HOA accountable. It became a space for collaboration and support, ensuring that no one would feel powerless again. When the HOA announced plans to revise their policies, Sam made sure representatives attended public forums so everyone's voice could be heard. As weeks turned into months, the HOA quietly faded into the background, its members too wary to stir up trouble after the backlash they'd faced. Rumor had it that several board members resigned, citing personal reasons. Whether true or not, the change in tone was undeniable. They now approached disputes with caution rather than aggression. For Ellie, the victory was bittersweet. She was grateful for the outpouring of love and support, but she also recognized how close she'd come to losing everything. Still, she refused to let bitterness take root. Instead, she focused on cherishing every moment, whether it was watching Jack work in the yard or hosting impromptu gatherings under the oak tree. Her ranch wasn't just her home anymore. It was a sanctuary for anyone who needed a place to belong. And Jack, he found himself rethinking his future while he loved his consulting job. Being back at the ranch reminded him of simpler joys, the kind that couldn't be measured in paychecks or promotions. As he stood one evening beneath the sprawling branches of the oak tree, he realized something important. This was where he belonged, not because it was easy, but because it was worth fighting for. As the seasons changed, so did life on the ranch. The once tense atmosphere gave way to a sense of renewal and hope. Ellie's garden flourished with vibrant sunflowers, roses, and vegetables she lovingly tended to each morning. The barn stood proudly with its freshly patched red paint, blending seamlessly into the landscape it had been part of for decades. Even the old tractor remained in its usual spot near the shed, a quiet testament to the Thompson family's history. But more than anything, the ranch was alive with laughter and connection again. It wasn't just Ellie's home anymore. It had become a gathering place for neighbors who wanted to celebrate their shared victory. Jack made his decision official. He would stay. Leaving behind his consulting career, he embraced a simpler life at the ranch. He converted one of the unused outbuildings into a small workshop where he could tinker with tools and repair things around the property. In the evenings, he often sat on the porch with Ellie, sipping coffee as they watched the sunset. Their conversations grew deeper, filled with stories they'd never shared before. For Ellie, having Jack back felt like finding a missing puzzle piece, and for Jack, being there gave him a purpose he hadn't realized he was searching for. The community continued to thrive too. The Neighbors United group Sam started blossomed into something much bigger. What began as a platform to hold the HOA accountable evolved into a network of support for anyone in need. When Mrs. Peterson down the road fell ill, neighbors organized a meal train to ensure she had food while recovering. When young Tommy's family struggled to afford school supplies, donations poured in anonymously. The spirit of unity that had sparked during the fight against the HOA carried over into everyday acts of kindness. Even the HOA underwent a transformation, albeit quietly. With new leadership and revised policies, they adopted a more collaborative approach. Board meetings became less about enforcing rigid rules and more about listening to residents' concerns. They even hosted an annual picnic to foster better relationships within the community. While some still viewed them with skepticism, most agreed that the change was significant and long overdue. One crisp autumn afternoon, Ellie decided to host a special gathering at the ranch. She invited everyone who had supported her during the ordeal. The neighbors, Sam, Mr. Peterson, and even a few former HOA members brave enough to attend. Tables were set up under the sprawling oak tree, adorned with homemade pies, casseroles, and pitchers of lemonade. As people mingled, laughter echoed through the air, mingling with the rustle of leaves overhead. Ellie stood up to speak, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "I never thought I'd see this day," she began, looking around at the smiling faces. "When all of you came together for me, for us, I felt something I haven't felt in years. Hope. This ranch isn't just my home. It's a reminder of what we can achieve when we stand together." Jack grinned from his seat beside her, raising his glass in a silent toast. The crowd erupted in applause, cheering not just for Ellie, but for the strength of their community. That evening, as golden sunlight filtered through the oak tree's branches, it was clear that the ranch, and the people connected to it, had been forever changed. For Ellie, the victory wasn't just about saving her land. It was about rediscovering joy, love, and belonging. For Jack, it was about finding peace after years of searching. And for the town, it was proof that standing up for what was right could bring people closer than ever before. Under the watchful gaze of the ancient oak tree, the future looked brighter than ever, a legacy built not just on memories, but on resilience, unity, and hope.